Hi, my name is Easton Lewis, and today I'll be going over Chapter 13, which is Law of Property, Real and Personal. At the beginning of this chapter, it describes what property is. And property is a bundle of rights in relation to others to possess, use, and dispose. It pertains to tangible or intangible objects. Possession of property facilitates acquisition of more property. Individuals with disproportionate amounts of property can influence society. The types are real property and personal property. Real property is land and everything permanently attached to it. Items that, if removed, would cause damage to the property are considered attached. Fixture is also described in real property, and that is an item that is a piece of personal property which is later attached permanently to the realty and treated as part of it. The exceptions is a written agreement declaring specific fixtures as personal property and trade fixtures. The chapter also discusses the extent of ownership, and this is physical components surrounding land that are entitled to the owner include the airspace above the land, water rights, which is legal ability to use water flowing across or underneath one's property, and mineral rights, which is legal ability to dig or mine the minerals from the surface below one land. Life estate and future interest is also described in the chapter. Life estate is the right to own or possess the land until one dies. This usage is restricted than that of fee simple absolute. Future interest is present right to possess and own in the future and exists in conjunction with a life estate or conditional estate. Next is leasehold and easement. Leasehold is a right to possess property for an agreed upon period of time stated in a lease. A lease is a contract that transfers possessory interest in a property from the leaser to the leasee. A leaser is the owner of the property. A leasee is the holder of the lease. Easement is irrevocable right to use some proportion of another's land for a specific purpose. Next is a license and co-ownership. A license is temporary and revocable right to be on someone else's property. A co-ownership is the ownership of land by multiple persons or business organizations. All tenants have the equal right to occupy all of the property. Next, the chapter describes joint ownership and the types of it, the division of ownerships, the right of ownership's creditors, and the ownership of property upon death. One type is the tenancy in common. The division of ownership in the tenancy in common is equal or unequal shares. The rights of owners' creditors can attach an interest in this type, and ownership of the property upon death is transferred to hers. The next type is the joint tenancy. The joint tenancy division of ownership is equal shares, and the rights of owners' creditors can attach interests. Ownership of the property upon death is divided among other joint tenants in this type of joint ownership. The next type is the tenancy by the entity. The division of ownership for this type is equal shares. The rights of owners and creditors cannot attach interest, and the ownership of property upon death goes to the surviving spouse. Next, the chapter describes the condominium ownership interest, and this is when an owner acquires title to a unit within a building and undivided interest in lands, buildings, and improvements of the common areas of the development. That requires filing declaration of convenience, conditions, and restrictions, which is known as the CC&Rs. Associates form has the power to levy assignments against owners to maintain, insure, repair, and replace the common areas and fine owners who do not comply with the CC&Rs. Next is the cooperatives. This is an investor resident that acquires stock in the corporate that owns the facility and receives a permanent lease on one's unit. The board of directors are elected from among the unit owners and establish rules for the unit owners. Members may be evicted for violation of the rules. The evicted member's unit would be purchased by the cooperative. Next is a voluntary transfer of real property. This is when the owner may transfer the property to anyone for an amount of consideration or for no consideration. Procedures for the property transfer of property include extinction, delivery, and acceptance. It is presumed that conveyance of ownership is a conveyance of fee simple absolute. Next is the type of deeds. The generally warranty deed is a grantor owns that the land has the right to convey it, and the land has no encumbrances other than those stated in the deed. It includes the convenience ceasing, the convenience of the right to own to convey, the convenience against encumbrances, convenient for the quiet enjoyment, and the convenient for further assurances. The quitclaim deed transfers the interest that the grantor owns in the property to the grantee. Next is the involuntary transfer of real property. This talks about the adverse possession, which is acquiring ownership by the realty by the opening, treating it as one's open for the statutorily established period of time. The real owner neither protests nor permits possession. Commendation is the government acquisition of private property for public use over protest of the owner of the property. The result of the government's right to inherit an intimate domain. An intimate domain is the government's constitutional right to take privately owned property for public purposes in exchange for just compensation. Next is the restrictive conveniences. And this is promises by the owner to use or not use the land in particular ways. It includes in the deeds. Restrictions are placed in the CC&Rs and may be enforced by the homeowners association for the development in which one's house is located, and it is strongly enforced by the courts. Next, the chapter describes zoning. This is government restrictions placed on the use of private property to ensure the orderly growth and development of a community, protect the health, safety, and welfare of the citizens. And the variance was just permission given to landowner to use land owned in a manner prohibited by the zoning laws. It is granted to prevent undue hardship. Zoning is allowed under police power. Police power is regulated powers and known to the state to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the public. Zoning ordinance is unreasonable if it is not carried out by the legitimate government purpose. There is no reasonable relationship what needs to obtain and the means to use for it, and if it totally destroys the economic value of a property's homeowner's land. Personal property is all property that is not real property. It is tangible or intangible property. Tangible property is property that is material or movable. Intangible property is property that does not have a physical form or evidence in writings. Next is the voluntary transfer of personal property. Personal property is acquired by its voluntary transfer as a result either of as a purchase or a gift. The title refers to ownership of property. Purchase is acquiring party gives some consideration to the seller in exchange for a title to the property. A gift is no consideration is given to the seller. The donative intent is the intent to transfer ownership to another at the time if the donor makes an actual constructed delivery to that gift to the donee. Next is the involuntary transfers of personal property, and this discusses abandoned property, and this is property that the original owner has discarded. A person who finds the property becomes owner by possessing it. Lost property is true owner unknowingly or accidentally dropped or left the property somewhere with no way of knowing how to retrieve it. The finder has title to lost goods against all exceptions to the true owner. And then next is the mislaid property. And this is the owner intentionally placed the property somewhere but has forgotten its location. A person who owns the realty on which the property was placed has the right to hold it. And then next is the bailment. And this is bailiff transfers possessions of personal property to the bailee to be used in an agreed upon manner for an agreed upon period of time. Can benefit the bailer, bailee, or both. Damage to the property caused by an act of God, which the bailee has not held liable. Bailee may retain possession of the property until the bailment compensation is paid. The bailiff must warn the bailee of hidden defects in the bailiff goods. And then lastly for the chapter is the advantages and disadvantages of personal property aboard. The advantages, it helps diversity investments, helps gain certain rights in the country where the property is bought. And lastly, the disadvantages is a high risk involved with regard to currency fluctuation and the political stability of a foreign country. And certain countries place restrictions of the ability of foreigners to buy their property. U.S. mortgage companies may not finance purchases of foreign real estate. So that's all I have for this chapter. I thought this chapter was really interesting, learning about the properties and how to possess ownership over, the variations of ownership with them. So I can't wait to learn more and continue with chapter 14. Thanks.